study done in 2018 about strategy within organizations. And they went out and they interviewed and spoke to at least 4,000 people across different businesses. And they asked the question, how many of you can name the strategic priorities of your own organization, i.e. the strategy of your own organization? And what they actually found from this survey was this, that nobody in your own organization actually understood the business strategy. They couldn't name the strategic priorities of their own business. Now, if you look at the bottom line on this graph, you will see that only about 14 or 15% of frontline staff are connected to the wider strategy of the organization. That really wasn't a big surprise for me when I first saw this, because that's what you tend to see in organizations. The bigger surprise for me was the top line. And that showed almost 50% of senior management team members on the board, the people who were assigning and designing the strategy of their own organizations, still couldn't understand what their own strategy was. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if the senior leaders who are actually developing their own strategy for their own business, if they don't understand where the organization's going, how are your frontline staff, employees, ever going to know where your business is heading? So this also has a knock-on effect to when strategy is actually executed on the ground, when teams go out onto the ground and they start delivering the business strategy. And this is because strategy execution is a people problem. It's not necessarily a strategy problem. Because strategy is executed by your employees on the shop floor. Okay? These are the ones who are actually out there day in, day out, making your strategy become real. But another stat which has come out, that almost 90% of strategy execution fails as well. So you've got this massive disconnect between organizations not knowing their own strategy and also strategies failing. And that really creates this whole lack of engagement from your employees. They really don't become motivated by what's happening in your organization. They don't see how they fit in to the wider organization and where you are heading in your business. So a few of the big issues we think about when it comes to the problem with engagement from various stakeholders in your own businesses. We have this low buy-in, okay, and resistance to change. And this always happens. You see this in every business you will probably work in. You have a strong resistance to change. And it's because they're not generally connected to the wider purpose of that organization. They also have missed opportunities. So if they don't understand where the business is heading, how are they ever going to help you identify new opportunities in your business to improve, new customers to target, and other areas? Okay? And this all can lead to that unsuccessful implementation of business strategy because your employees kind of feel like they're being held back. Okay? They really don't understand what is going on in your company. All they hear is words. They hear words from you if you're sitting on the board. They just hear words. They don't actually hear, they can't connect to the actual purpose of what you were doing in your organization. So we have to think about this differently when we develop our business strategy. So the first point I want to bring up is making strategy behind closed doors is a prescription for failure. So the old way of creating a business strategy is that you lock yourself in a room and the whole board sits there, goes away for a break, and you develop a business strategy. But that leads to a lot of siloed thinking and a lot of narrow thinking. So you need to think about how can you actually open this strategy process up as you go forward. So one of the things we like to talk about is flipping this on its head and actually involving stakeholders right from the start of the process. Okay? So stakeholders can be employees, it could be customers, it could be regulators, it could be all these different areas. Similar to what Brian Gladden spoke about earlier in Blue Ocean Strategy, where we start thinking about all the different types of stakeholders and all the different types of people we engage with on a daily basis. So we need to think about that as we move forward. Because really important, that commitment of your teams comes from empowerment. You can't just pass on commitment by authority, okay? You have to think about empowering your teams in your organizations. And this is going to become even more prevalent as we move forward with the new generation, or the Zoomers, as they call this, where the Zoomers really want to be connected to their organization. They want to have input into where their organization's going. Totally different to my father's generation, who was told, go and do that, don't ask questions. Okay? So different of how we have to work. Because ultimately, you want your teams in your business and your organization to all be on the same page. You'll all understand the direction of the business, and they all feel like they have some input into what you're actually doing. So this is for me, is really, really important as we think about this going forward, especially with that new generation Z, the Zoomers, as they become managers in organizations. So a few things to think about. We're going to talk about this thing called open strategy. Open strategy allows you to generate ideas from the wider organization or from external stakeholders. And what you're trying to do, you're trying to stop this strategy development process where you've only got a certain senior members of the team in meeting rooms designing your strategy. You need to think about how can you bring in other perspectives which are going to help you develop something better for the future, okay? And think differently. Again, this is connected to what Brian was talking about in Blue Ocean Strategy and how you start thinking about how your business is going to be in the future. So this is a phrase I like. This is from a guy called Andy Grove. Andy Grove was the CEO from Intel from the 1970s to the 1990s. And he said this, "The ice melts from the edges." Now, you may be wondering why I'm putting that quote into a presentation about business strategy. But it's because, as senior leaders, you are more likely in the middle of that ice. You are further away from the customer and other stakeholders than your teams. So what we need to think about is how can we bring in your frontline teams into the strategy process? How can we get their ideas? How can we get their input from what they're hearing from customers and other stakeholders? It's really important that we think about this as we develop our business strategy. So open strategy has been around for quite a long time now, and there's a great book on this called Open Strategy. But really what open strategy does, it works on three premises. The first one is building that transparency in your strategy process. Not only does that transparency build trust, it also helps the organization communicate better. We also have this inclusiveness as well. You're involving all these different voices who can participate in the wider strategy process, which is really, really important when you are developing a strategy. So I have a practical example of this. I was working with a company recently who has a closed strategy process. They went away and they developed their strategy. And what they found was they developed this beautiful strategy on paper. And then they actually rolled it out to the organization. And as soon as it hit the organization, some of the middle managers said, this will never work. And the obvious question was, why wouldn't it work? And it was because the senior managers weren't close enough to the actual process and understood how they did things in the organization, that the middle managers recognized it straight away, that there was a disconnect, there was a problem. Now, if they'd involved middle managers into that process, they would have actually understood that much earlier. So they've wasted all that time and effort. So we need to think about how can we open this process up to try and develop better insights as we move forward. So if you look at this diagram here, this is from openstrategy.info, which is a great website if you're interested in opening up a strategy process. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you will see the traditional strategy process. And what I tend to see in organizations when I work in their strategy, is I tend to see it's either strategy formulation, how we're going to do something, and then execution. Okay? They either focus on one or the other. And what we want to try and do, we want to try and go up the scale to the top right-hand corner. And in that, we want to have this compatibility between strategy formulation and strategy execution. Because you need to connect that formulation and that execution as you move forward in your organization. So we contrast open strategy, the open approach, the transparent approach to strategy. We contrast it to traditional approaches. Like I said, you're more likely going to be running your strategy processes, only senior leaders are involved, you lock yourself in a room, and then you start debating what your strategy is going to be going forward. Really, that is full of secrecy in what your organization's doing, and it also breeds exclusivity as well. Only senior managers are allowed to be involved in this process. It also looks at top-down decision-making. So everything's made right at the top. There's no decisions made below that. Okay? So we need to think about that, how this contrasts. There's also limited communication. So you think about when strategy is rolled out in your organizations, you will hear the same things. This is what we're going to focus on. These are our messages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you don't understand the why. Why are we focusing on what we're focusing on? So let's think about that differently. And another key statement we think about is this one. Hoarding strategy isn't helping companies, it's killing them. And it's killing them for lots of different reasons, but I'm just going to pick out 4 or 3 I'll talk about. One is mimicking strategies. So you just copy a competitor in the market. But all that's doing is you're just becoming a Me Too business. You're just becoming exactly the same as everyone else. How are you going to compete if you're just competing against, or you're just trading the same way as everyone else? Okay? You want to be different. The second thing is this argumentative strategies. So think about, you're just constantly evolving what you're doing, but you're only making small incremental improvements. You're not making big changes in what you need to do. You're not looking at new ways to develop things. A bit like Brian said on that Blue Ocean strategy, looking at what your customers value. With this approach is unimaginative. You also, really important from my perspective, you have bias strategies. So generally, most senior teams in organizations have worked in the industry for quite a long time. What does that create? That creates biased mindsets. Things have always been done this way. We've got to continue this. It always does in every organization you see. You always got to think about bringing different perspectives into your strategy process as you develop your annual strategy. But the first thing we need to think about is, who are your stakeholders? Okay, so we hear the term stakeholders, but who are they in your organizations? And there's different ways of looking at stakeholders. So we can look at internal stakeholders. Most likely these are going to be employees. These are going to be people who are involved day to day, understanding your business. But then there's external. There's customers, there's regulators, there's institutions, there's lots of different people you can think about and organizations you can bring in to your process. And I'd be interested, just as a rhetorical question, to see how many of you actually bring customers into your strategy process when you actually develop it. I bet there isn't many, but it's really powerful to do that when you're developing your strategy going forward. And when you've identified them, you can start mapping those stakeholders. So you can start, this is just an example framework, but you can think about where do the stakeholders sit? Okay, this is called the power and interest grid. But once you've identified who these employees are, customers are, all these different areas, you can start plotting them. And then from that, you can start developing communication plans, ways of engaging with these people, okay, in your organization. Like I said, though, this is only one diagram or one chart. There's plenty of others out there, but the important thing is being able to model this, okay, to identify who are those stakeholders that you want to engage with. Because if you don't know who you're actually engaging with, how can you even start anything like this? Okay, so really important we think about that. So an example framework that you could use. The first thing you really want to think about when you actually, once you've engaged your stakeholders in your strategy process, is you want to define your scope of your strategy. So we all hear things like vision statements. Vision statements are really powerful, but they're really a target for 3 to 5 years, potentially, in your business. So you need to understand what's the gap between where you currently are today and where you want to be, okay? And you just need to define that. And then from that, you can then identify those different stakeholders, you can plot them on a map, and then from that, you can then develop those engagement plans as you move forward, okay? So what we're trying to do here is we're building a good picture away from just being an exclusive team in your business developing strategy, and we can actually bring more perspectives in to what you're doing. So, for this, we can use different approaches from open strategy to do this, okay? And we engage those stakeholders from day one. Now, I often hear people say to me, organizations will say, leaders will say, well, open strategy only works in small businesses. It doesn't work in large organizations. But that's not true. There's lots of large organizations which implement an open strategy approach. So if you look at the first one, Barclays Bank. Okay, Barclays, huge bank. Everyone knows Barclays Bank. Major organization. They run a competition internally called the Strategy Jam, or the Barclays Jam as they call it. And what they do, they crowdsource business ideas, okay, from their employees and from different stakeholders. And they generally run this strategy process of crowdsourcing ideas for around 48 hours. And you could imagine across the whole of the globe how many insights they potentially get, which is going to help them develop their strategy. And when we think about this, this is the process they went through. So they select the goals for the jam. What do they actually want to achieve out of this? They then structure that jam. What's the scope? They then think about building a forum where they can start getting all those insights together. Once they've done that, they run it, and then they analyze what their employees are saying, okay, and perspectives from various people in the organization. And then they can make decisions from that. But you can see, hopefully, from that, you are crowdsourcing a massive amount of data and a massive amount of insights from the frontline staff in your organization, compared to a traditional process where you have an analyst going through all the different things. But now you are crowdsourcing. We also think about other ways of doing it. Buffer, the social media management company. They actually publish everything about their strategy. They publish all their documents. They publish all their insights. They publish absolutely everything. And they get various people to feed back to them. And what that's doing is, that's opening, again, that process up, and it's allowing them to start thinking about getting different perspectives into this process, which is, again, so different to how we normally do strategy. And if Buffer and Barclays Bank can do this, I'm sure a lot of other organizations can do it as well. Lego. Everyone's heard of Lego. You know, Lego's really great fun to play with, even if you're an adult. If you think about Lego, they actually do this on two fronts. They do co-creation workshops with different stakeholders, okay? Could be customers, can be employees. They bring them together. They start developing new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. They also have a website where they actually submit all their different product ideas. So I could go on there and I could put a product idea, people can upvote it. And then from that, they can know what's going on in the market. So again, it's another great way of thinking about how can we develop strategy. And also, Lego's fun. You know, as an adult, I love playing with Lego still. Advisory boards is a bit more traditional. Most of you have probably got advisory boards and how you do things. But Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company, when they started developing their strategy, they had advisory boards made up of scientists, researchers, other organizations, which helped them give input into what they were doing, which allowed them to actually develop a more inclusive strategy. Okay, so again, we're opening this process up. Really important that we do that. Social media. I bet everyone in here uses social media. I bet every business uses social media, but I bet you use it in two ways. I bet one, you either get feedback from customers, but secondly, you use it to advertise. Dell did something different. They set up something called the Idea Storm, which allowed them to crowdsource lots of different ideas across the wider pool of stakeholders. Not just internal, but also external customers. And you can see this from this. This is an early screenshot of their website. You can clearly say at the top, you've got a call to action there. Help us become the greenest technology company on the planet. You probably can see as well, in the middle there, they developed over 5,500 new ideas, which were pushed in to their strategy formulation process. So you're getting much more ideas as you develop this. Open data. Open data is another way of thinking about open strategy. A lot of people say we can't share our data. You can. The British government, as an example, has an open data initiative, which allows them to actually share the data with various stakeholders, which allows them to get feedback on what they're doing, okay? Which again feeds into their process. So you've got to think about this as you go forward. Okay. So getting towards the end now, I just need to wrap up, but if we think about this from different angles, we start small, okay, and we gradually expend our efforts. We don't go for big bang approaches. And as an example here, you can think about different steps you can take. So you think about communicating the vision. You think about building a forum that you can start getting information, start getting insights from various people. You empower employees to do that, and you start leveraging that technology. And then from that, you can then adjust your strategy, develop a wider, more embracing strategy, which is a lot more transparent. So one of the last comments I just want to say, again, is this one. Commitment of employees generally comes from empowerment. If they feel that they're part of the process, they will generally be it's much better for your organizations. They won't feel like a cog in your organization. They will feel like something which actually matters. So just to wrap up, Some important things we think about: build transparency with open strategy in your business. Don't have it as a closed event. Build inclusiveness and participation in your process. And don't think only small organizations can do it. If you look at Barclays with crowdsourcing ideas, you look at Lego, you look at the British government, what have they done? They've used open strategy to help them get new ideas. Okay, so that was only a very quick talk on this subject. It's a very, very big topic. But if you're interested, have a look for a book called Open Strategy. It's a fantastic book on this subject. A lot of large organizations have done this. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn. I'm on there. I generally post most days. And thank you.